My daughter once told me that she had a best friend in her closet. At the age of 6, she made a crayon drawing of him, a lanky man in a suit, a crooked grin, and a small house in the background. She put their names on each drawing. My name was not one of them. Children create friends out of trees and shadows. She used to place a small cup on the closet's floor and leave the light on for him. My wife didn't hear him, and neither did I. It was worse than feeling his presence. Outside her room, I waited and listened for the noise of the hangers and her soft voice. I heard no sounds, but the closet door went this way and that, like a slow breath. Nothing else. She kept making pictures. She depicted those children with stick figures holding hands with the man. Names from missing children posters that I had seen at the grocery store were the labels she gave to those kids, and I hid those pictures in my desk. The match could just be a coincidence, I told myself. I looked into the baby room through the monitor on the night she disappeared and saw her bed without her. Her blanket was folded nicely, and her little shoe was next to the door. I rushed into her room and down the hall. The light was on, and the closet door was wide open. Police officers appeared, and they interrogated me. They showed photos from different cases. Each drawing of the same man belonged to a missing child. A house was depicted in each of the drawings, and an open closet door was visible in each house. They wanted to know if we had locks and alarms, if there were neighbors, and so forth. I gave them my answers. While folding paper, I swallowed the unpleasant taste that comes from fear. No signs of forced entry were discovered. However, a minuscule dust smear was found on the inside of the shelf, as if someone had come from their place to stay in my house. I was in her room at night again. After opening the closet, I bent over and pretended I was sleeping. I was interested to know the man's method of movement. My fingers were then covered by a small hand which was warm and did not belong to my daughter. "Thank you for leaving the door open," a polite voice said. Leaning out from behind the coats was a thin face. The appearance was similar to the drawings. He grinned and was well acquainted with who I am.
At 1:52 a.m., my phone rings. It's my husband. He already texted me letting me know he was on his way home from work. Worried that something was wrong, I answer. Me. "Hey babe, you okay?" Him. Silence. Me. "Babe?" Him. "Can you hear me?" Me. "I can now. Are you okay?" Him. "I don't know what just happened. I'm almost home, but I saw something. I'm about to lose service. Be waiting on me, please." I get out of bed and stand at the front door, waiting to see his headlights come down our long driveway. He gets in the door with a shocked look on his face. This is what he said. "I saw these things, these tall white things. A tall white woman with two other tall white people. Not white like the skin color, snow white. They were standing out by the abandoned train tracks on X Road. The woman had what my brain could only compare to a trash bag with a light. I know that's not what it was, but that's what it reminded me of. When I saw them, they noticed me too, and I got this feeling. I can't explain it, but I just needed to get out of there. An unease came over me. I'm not sure what they were, but it wasn't right. They're not humans." I started reheating his dinner, and then it hit me. This automatically made me think of the tall whites. I Googled tall whites and asked my husband if any of the photos were comparable. He scrolled to one image and said, "Yes, this is close." The next morning, we decided to go back to where he saw them. And there was a black mark on the ground, like something scorched the earth. Even more puzzling was that it had lightly rained the night before. It was raining when he saw them. Nobody lives in the area where he saw them. It's just an old one-lane road that connects two larger roads and crosses the abandoned railroad tracks. We also live in the outskirts of a very tiny little town. It's unlikely that anyone was this far out, making a fire directly next to the road and tracks. As we're walking towards the car, an old man in a beat-up old Ford pulls up beside us. He says, "Hey, what y'all up to?"
Neither of us recognized him. We just nodded and said, "We were looking at something. Is our car in your way?" He puts the truck in park and gets out. He says, "No, y'all are fine. Did you kids see something interesting?" My husband said, I saw something out here the other night on my way home from work. Not sure what it was, though." The old man says, "Is that right? I live over that way, have all my life," as he points to the highway. An awkward silence falls over us for a few seconds as we're walking to the car. Then he says, "Y'all believe in aliens?" My husband and I both looked at each other. I say, "Yes, actually we do." He goes on to tell us that he and his late wife experienced a lot of strange occurrences out there over the years. He said the scorch mark was from them, and asked if we'd ever seen anything in the sky that was unidentifiable. My husband showed him a video that was taken a couple months back of a UFO over our house. He invited us over to his house, saying that he had some images he'd like to show us. It may not have been the best decision, but we agreed. My husband has his carry permit, so I wasn't too worried. We followed him to an old farmhouse. He said his grandparents built the house in the 1800s, and all of them have seen and experienced things on or around the property. He goes to a little garage or shack and retrieves some old Polaroid pictures. All 5 photos pictured your classic flying saucer. He said, "My father took these. There's more in the house somewhere." He goes on to tell us that he's not exactly sure where they come from or why they're here, but he knows there's different species and different kind of craft. I'd like to think we gained a friend, but I'm still not 100% sure what my husband encountered. I thought I'd share the story here.
My Uncle Trent died last week. Official cause of death was cirrhosis. He had been 75 years old. Quite frankly, he made it much longer than any of us had been expecting. I know how callous that sounds, but it is what it is. Guy never put down the bottle. I had been really young at the time, but from what my dad had told me, Trent had been a perfectly happy guy up until the day he left for Vietnam. He'd had a lot of friends, had been popular with women, maintained good relationships with family, had a degree in civil engineering. Such a far cry from the person that had come back that we almost wanted to question whether or not he'd been replaced. After he returned to the U.S., he decided to just stop participating in life, a spiritual suicide of sorts. He broke up with his girlfriend, never applied to any jobs, never reached out to friends or family, never had any hobbies or seemed to do anything at all. He rented a small studio apartment on the edge of town and just stayed in there, drinking and smoking the days away. It was a mystery how he always seemed to have enough money to cover his expenses. For a while, I just assumed that either my dad or grandfather had been subsidizing him from afar. But I would later learn that wasn't the case. Never had he asked them for money. Even when they'd offered some to him with no strings attached, he had refused, told them he didn't need it. I tried to visit him every now and then, but my motivation to do so really dwindled near the end. I'd like to think it wasn't because I was a terrible nephew or anything. It was just hard to talk to the guy, hard to deal with him. After every visit, I would walk away with this terrible taste in my mouth. And it wasn't just from breathing in the booze fumes and cigarette smoke. He never seemed willing to reciprocate any sort of conversation, never said more than a few words at a time. He'd always just stare ahead at the television, and I couldn't tell if he were actually paying attention to what was on the screen or if he were just dissociating. There were moments where it almost seemed like he wanted to tell me something. He'd look away from the screen and stare at me with this tortured expression, as if he desperately wanted to get something off his chest, but just couldn't bring himself to do it. He'd open his mouth as if ready to speak, And then nothing. Always nothing. So you can imagine how shocked I was when I got a call from my mother telling me that Trent wanted to see me, that he wanted to talk to me about something. I'm sure my dad would have been the one to tell me, but he had passed from cancer a few years back. At first, I wasn't so sure how I felt about the idea. After all these years, all of my efforts to try and get through to him, and now he finally wanted to talk?
I wanted to be more pissed off than I actually was. But in truth, I still had some grace left to spare the guy. Maybe he'd realized that his time left on Earth was short and regretted pushing so many people away. Perhaps this was an attempt at some kind of closure. At the same time, I couldn't deny how curious I was. Maybe he'd finally tell me what had happened over there, though I wasn't totally convinced that I wanted to know. I drove over to his apartment and knocked on his door. I heard him coughing inside before telling me that the door was unlocked, to come right in. My first time entering the place in over a decade, and it smelled and looked so much worse than I had remembered. A sense of heavy despair floating around in the air. Trent was sitting on the same couch he always had, though now it looked like it belonged in a landfill. Cracks in the paint, stains all over. Spread out across the old coffee table in front of him were several beer cans, liquor bottles, cigarette butts. The smell of mold and rot was nearly overpowering the smoke. He turned around, and it's hard to understate the dread I felt looking at his face. Hard to see him in such a state. Made me feel like an asshole for not doing more to help. But I had tried. A lot of us had. I walked over and sat down on the couch beside him. I asked him how he was feeling. He shook his head, told me not to bother, that I didn't need to pretend, that he was sick but not senile, that he was well aware of the costs of his behavior over the last 50 or so years and didn't blame any of us for no longer wanting to deal with him. But it wasn't an accident. It had been a very calculated decision. Hearing him say all this caught me off guard. From what I could recall, this was the longest conversation we'd ever had. And even more surprising was how lucid he seemed. I thought the decades of alcohol abuse would have taken more of a toll. But here he was, eyes and voice as earnest as anybody I'd seen before. I told him that I had no doubts he had experienced things more terrible than I could have imagined, but he never had to deal with it alone. We had been there for him. So why had he chosen a life of solitude? And this is where the conversation took a strange turn. Trent took a long exhale and looked around the apartment. Then he said it was because he never wanted to put any of us in danger. I stared at him, asked what he meant by that. What kind of danger? He told me he wasn't exactly sure, which is why it scared him so much. He claimed that if he were to tell me what had happened to him, I needed to be ready to deal with the consequences, that once I was privy to such knowledge, it would complicate my life in ways that would be hard to deal with, that I'd likely be forced to look over my shoulder for the rest of my years. But if I was prepared to take that risk, then I should pour myself some whiskey and get ready to listen.
Hearing him say these things made my heart drop. Not because I believed him, but because it all but confirmed his deteriorating state of mind. Articulate as he still was, he was clearly no longer there. I decided to humor him. I smiled, told him that I was willing to take the risk. But once the words left my mouth, I could see his expression sour. "You don't believe me," he said. "You think these are the ramblings of a man gone wild." I didn't expect the immediate pushback. I didn't know what to say, and so I began stumbling over my words, searching for an answer. "I don't blame you," he continued. "I don't. I know I'm near the end. I know my mind's nearly gone. But this is something that, even in death, I'll never forget. You want to know why I drink? It's because if I don't, and it's all I can think about, all I can dream about." He paused and lit up a cigarette and took several long drags before staring at me. Knowledge can be a burden. If you're going to hear this, then I need to know that you believe me, that you've accepted the risk. Otherwise, we can just forget about it. You can go on and live your life with no worries. I still wasn't sure what to think, but my curiosity had started to burn. I asked him why he even wanted to tell me about it. If it was so dangerous, then why didn't he just keep it to himself? He said that he didn't have a good answer to that. He just felt like somebody needed to know what had happened before it died with him. He said that there exists a darkness in this world that's beyond anything we've been taught, anything we were familiar with, anything we had the ability to understand. And one day, we might have to deal with it.
It was the spring of 1967. He was in the Central Highlands, part of a platoon of about 30 trekking through deep jungle. Their objective had been to make contact with a French intelligence officer named Bernier, who would then guide them to a sizable NVA camp that they were meant to ambush and subsequently commandeer. Simple directives. But to actually execute them without dying or getting maimed would have been some Herculean feat. At that point, he'd already witnessed 23 others face a variety of gruesome ends. He remembered that exact number because each one had been burned so deep into his psyche that it was hard not to keep a tally. Every moment spent in the jungle put him on edge. He was always paranoid, tired, scared. He said it had to be some version of hell. That particular day, the air had been hot and thick, a heavy sun blazing above. Mosquitoes were constantly swarming around their heads, while ants were constantly crawling up their boots. His arms were heavy from hacking away bamboo and large rattan vines. He could smell moss, earth, sharp and acrid odors from wildlife, sweat and gun oil from wafting off his fellow draftees. His feet ached, hot and wet in his boots. Trench foot had become a common issue, and he feared it would reach him soon. They had been walking for a long time. How long exactly, he couldn't tell for sure, but he said that it felt longer than anything he'd ever done before. When night came, they slept on the ground, covering themselves with thin poncho liners. Of course, sleep didn't come, for any of them. As he laid on the soil, he could hear no snoring. He could hear nothing at all. Nothing. You could have heard a pin drop, which was unusual. So much so that he sat up the moment he realized this. Soon most everybody else was awake as well. He looked around in the darkness, though he wasn't sure what he was supposed to be looking for. But he could feel the hairs standing tall on the back of his neck, as if it were meant to be a signal that they were in the presence of something dangerous. They turned their flashlights on, and the soldiers stared between each other, as if their fellow man might have an answer for this strange thing they were all feeling. Before long, something shattered the silence. They all grabbed their rifles and stood, though none could make sense of the noise. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere above them. They looked up, and eventually one of their lights caught movement, something crawling down one of the trees. He said that it felt like his brain was short-circuiting when it tried processing what he was seeing. It was a human figure crawling on all fours down the trunk. That wasn't right. That couldn't be right.
They weren't able to get a good look at the creature person before it leapt onto a different tree, and then another. Soon it was bouncing between the trees at an unnervingly fast pace, and it wasn't much longer before the first shot was fired. Chaos erupted as erratic streams of gunfire cracked through the night. There was a lot of screaming, a lot of scrambling. They were dealing with just a singular target, but one that seemed impossible to hit. At one point, the figure had jumped onto the tree directly behind Trent. He turned around, shining his light on what looked to be a pale, naked, emaciated man. His eyes were sunken in, the skin on his face stretched tight across the skull. He had bushy eyebrows and thick, dark hair, hanging off of a branch with one arm like a primate. He was staring directly at Trent and smiling. His teeth were large, terribly rotten, small worms wriggling around between them. He said that his face was no further than a few feet away from his own, and he could see it so clearly that the image was instantly burned into his head, something incapable of being forgotten. He fumbled for his rifle, but by the time he had it steady in his hands, the man had leapt away into the darkness. A piercing, foul stench lingered in the air, something like sour milk mixed with a strange industrial element. It was so intense that it made him tear up. The entire platoon stayed awake for the rest of the night. When the sun came up, they marched on, deeper into the jungle. The morning was spent moving in silence. Nobody quite knew what to say. But after a while, somebody suggested that they head back. It was a request that was shut down fairly quick by Gutierrez, their platoon leader. Real hard-nosed guy. He said they had a job to do, that they were obligated by national duty to see it through no matter what. But he didn't sound so sure about it. His words lacked conviction, as if he had tried but failed to convince himself that he wasn't confused and terrified. They moved on. Trent said that the sun seemed brighter that day, a cloudless sky above. The boiling temperatures coupled with the sleep deprivation proved to be one hell of a thing. At around noon, they came across two corpses sprawled out on the ground, NVA soldiers, and the only reason they were able to figure this out was due to the SKS carbines laid out beside them. The actual bodies were indistinguishable, mutilated to a degree where they hardly resembled people at all. Dozens of chunks of flesh had been torn away. Several limbs were missing, as if they had been ripped straight off.
They were ready to believe that it could have been the work of a tiger or a wild boar until they saw a third body dangling by its entrails from one of the tree branches about 50 feet above. Still, Gutierrez insisted that it was just that, an animal, that the thing from the night before had also been an animal, that there was nothing weird going on and they had nothing to worry about. A few soldiers out of the platoon seemed ready to accept this, but the larger majority weren't. Somebody suggested that they abort the mission. Several more concurred. Gutierrez pushed back, claiming that they were closer to meeting up with Bernier than they were to the barracks, so they may as well continue on. A lot of arguing ensued. Emotions flared. Things got heated. Ultimately, they had a vote. 7 of them wanted to turn back, while the rest thought it better to press on. Those 7 ended up going back on their own. Trent admitted that he had considered going with them until he considered the logistics of it. They had no chance of making it back before nightfall. Better to go with strength and numbers. By the time that the sun had started to set again, the tension in the air was almost palpable. He said that his legs felt heavy and the blisters on his feet had started to open, but he pressed forward, doing his best to keep up with the group. At some point, somebody walked up next to him. He introduced himself as Duncan and then asked whether or not he'd seen it. Trent asked him what that was supposed to mean. Seen what? The man that had been jumping between the trees, Duncan told him. He wanted to know whether or not Trent had gotten a good look at his face. Trent nodded, told him that he had. Duncan then asked him to describe their appearance. As Trent did so, his face went pale. He told him that he'd seen what looked to be the same man around 10 minutes ago. He had been crouched down in the brush a few dozen feet behind the group, just staring at them as they walked. Duncan was about to shout at him when he suddenly disappeared, sinking into the ground. Those were the precise words he'd used, sunk straight down into the dirt. They mentioned this to Gutierrez, but he brushed them off, told them to keep moving and to keep staying alert. But his eyes contradicted his words. They could see the fear in them, the disbelief, the panic he was trying desperately to suppress. An uncomfortable feeling spread amongst them as the sky began to darken, because they should have already made contact with Bernier several hours ago. Gutierrez tried to rationalize this by claiming that they'd been moving too slow, that in order to make up for their lack of pace, they needed to press forward through the night, no setting up camp. And this is where things started to boil over. The rest of the platoon told him there was no way in hell that was happening. They were well over 40 hours without sleep in this blasted jungle, and their bodies were ready to collapse. They needed to rest. But Gutierrez wasn't so convinced. He told them that they could set up camp if they wanted to, but that he'd go ahead and make contact with Bernier himself.
They tried explaining to him how bad of an idea that was, but he was too stubborn, too delirious to be placated. He ended up marching forward into the darkness alone. Nobody else joined him. They began setting up for the night, and Trent volunteered to be part of the first night shift watch. Not because he wasn't tired. He certainly was. He said it felt like his eyeballs had been left out to dry for a week in the sun. But he also knew that as long as he was out in the jungle, he wasn't getting a lick of sleep, not after everything that had happened. The first hour or so was uneventful. He just sat there, looking up at the stars and listening to the near-deafening droning of the crickets, cicadas, whatever else was out there. He said that it managed to somewhat put him at ease, because the bugs were part of the natural environment. This is where they belonged. But the peace didn't last much longer. Soon the silence had returned. He said it was like a switch had been flipped. He couldn't explain it. In fact, there seemed to be no possible explanation at all. Even though there was no explicit threat, they all grabbed their rifles, though they kept their lights off. Not because anybody had ordered them to do so. It just happened to be a decision they all collectively arrived at, as if turning them on might expose them to whatever the hell was out there. But nothing happened. The silence persisted, and they were left in limbo, fingers itching their triggers, but without a target to aim for. Eventually, somebody pointed out something strange, a hole in the ground in front of them. The stars were bright enough that they didn't need to ask what he was talking about. They could all see it without issue. And it was just that, a hole in the ground. It was a perfect, pitch-black circle about the size of a manhole cover. They all just stared at it. Trent said he was really tempted to start shooting, but at what? What was supposed to happen here? Suddenly, something came flying out of it, as if somebody had been standing down in the hole and tossed it up. It was a body, horrifically mangled like the others. They looked back at the hole and saw it had disappeared. Then they looked back at the body. Despite the extent to which it had been mutilated, they were still able to tell exactly who it was. Gutierrez. They had been around him long enough for their brains to be able to fill in the missing details.
It looked like the entire left side of his face had been brutally cleaved off, though they couldn't be sure what exactly had done it. Maybe a large set of teeth, maybe a saw. He had one eye that remained intact, and it was stuck wide open, frozen into a perpetual look of terror. Trent had been hoping that the sleep deprivation had caused him to start hallucinating, but to his disbelief, everybody else confirmed that they were seeing the same thing, that Gutierrez's body had actually been tossed up from a hole in the ground, a hole that was now no longer there. He said that he didn't remember falling asleep that night, but that he must have done so at some point, because he remembered waking up in the daylight to the sound of something sizzling, the smell of meat, garlic, and onions. He sat up, rubbed his eyes. He stared ahead and saw a man crouched over a makeshift fire pit just a few feet away from where he'd been laying, using a stick to push around what looked like cubed slices of meat in a frying pan. He was wearing a windbreaker, cargo pants, boots. He wasn't carrying a weapon. Soon the rest of the platoon was awake as well, but nobody said a word. They all just stared at the guy, as if doing anything to catch his attention may end up proving dangerous. Eventually, the man put the stick down and turned to face them. Trent told me that the moment he saw his face, he had to swallow down the bile that was shooting up his throat. He appeared to be around 6'6", but deathly frail at the same time, to the point where it looked like a strong wind may cause him to sway. His skin was the shade of paper and pulled so tight against his skull that it almost looked like a mask. Everything about him was wrong, like some strange attempt to replicate a human, but one that hadn't gone quite right. It was the same guy from the other night. He said there was no mistaking it. The man stared at them for a while before smiling, revealing a set of sewage-colored teeth. A familiar stench came wafting through the air. Trent locked eyes with Duncan. He looked petrified. The man introduced himself as Bernier. He said it was nice to finally meet everyone. Nobody responded to him, and nobody moved. There came an uncomfortably long stretch of silence that was broken only when Bernier asked if anybody was hungry. Trent said they were surely all starving, but none said a word. They still hadn't overcome the initial shock. He looked around for Gutierrez's body, but it was no longer there. The man insisted that they try some of the beef that he'd cooked up, that they'd need the energy for the long trek ahead. Despite his strange appearance, the man's voice was normal enough, but his accent wasn't French. They couldn't tell exactly what it was. The man then reached behind his back and pulled out a large bottle of water. But he must have grabbed it out of thin air because he wasn't carrying a rucksack, wasn't carrying anything at all. Trent stared closely at the bottle and saw pieces of ice floating around in it, despite it being close to 90 degrees out. The man held it forward, asked if anybody was thirsty. Trent said his throat felt like sandpaper, but he said nothing. The man just kept holding it out, continuing to ask if anybody needed a drink. Eventually, somebody walked forward, seemingly ready to accept the offer. But Trent stepped in front of him, told him not to. He said that he wasn't sure where the sudden audacity had come from, that it was more of a visceral reaction, a primal need to protect his fellow man from danger. He said he was 100% certain it wasn't water in that bottle. The soldier looked confused, but didn't seem willing to fight him on it. He backed away. Suddenly the man's smile dropped, and he turned to look at Trent. He said to me that he had never seen such an expression of hatred before, that there was a kind of cruelty behind the eyes that seemed to transcend reality. But it lingered for only a few seconds before the smile returned. Trent said that he thought he could see some kind of worm trying to squirm out of his mouth through a gap in his teeth. The man placed the bottle on the ground and said it was there for anybody to take, but that they better get a move on because they had a long trek ahead. He took a few steps to the side, as if to make way for one of them to take the lead. Behind him was a path that Trent hadn't noticed before. A clean break in the vegetation. Way too clean. It looked unnatural, made even more so by the fact that it was too dark to see into, as if the space were swallowing every trace of sunlight. Once again the man told them that they better start moving, that they had a long trek ahead. But nobody moved. At that point, every man in the platoon had come to an unspoken understanding that before them stood an utterly evil presence, that under no circumstances could they give him what he wanted. So they just stared at him, unsure of how else to proceed. The man stared back at them, and they could see his smile slowly fading. He began repeating himself, the agitation escalating in his voice with each iteration. Better start moving. Long trek ahead. As if that were one of the few phrases he knew how to say. They didn't know what to do. They were all too terrified and bewildered by the man to try and confront him. So they just stood there, watching him. After what felt like an hour, they could hear the whirring of helicopter blades in the distance, heading their direction. Trent said that the relief he felt upon hearing it was nearly euphoric. The man looked up at the sky and then back down at them. Now that hateful expression had returned. He clenched his jaw tight, and Trent was nearly convinced that he was priming himself to leap at them. But then he turned, walked into the darkness of the path. Trent blinked, and the man was gone. And so was the path, just gone in an instant, as if they had both never been there.
They might have been able to rationalize the whole thing as some mass hallucination caused by some kind of experimental gas that was being tested on them. But the frying pan and the bottle were still there. The fire was still going. The meat now burnt to blackened scraps. Just a few minutes later, they watched as several helicopters descended down into a nearby clearing. Shortly after, they were all extracted back to base. Of course, they had a lot of questions, but no matter how many they asked, they weren't getting any answers back. They were simply told to sit in the barracks and wait. But for what? What the hell had just happened? After a while, each member of the platoon was questioned individually by men in suits. CIA agents, he assumed, though he couldn't confirm this. Trent said that describing what had happened out loud made him want to question whether or not any of it was real. It all just seemed so absurd. But the suits didn't seem to think so. They listened intently to everything he had to say. Nothing in their tones, expressions, or language suggested that they were incredulous about any of it, which freaked him out even more. At one point, he asked them point blank who the hell this man was. The suits told him that they didn't know, that they'd never been able to find out.
The next day, they were all put on a flight back to the U.S. They were simply told that they'd satisfied their obligations, that their tour of duty was officially over. But they knew this wasn't true, because the standard length of a tour was 12 months, and they hadn't even been there for 8. But nobody questioned it. They were all just happy to get the hell out of there. Trent took a taxi home from the airport. Once it pulled up to his building, he saw another suit standing in front of his door. The guy flashed him a CIA badge and introduced himself as Miller. Then he asked if they could go inside and have a quick chat. Trent said that the guy didn't seem threatening or anything, but that there was a strange energy coming off of him, something that he couldn't quite wrap his head around. Once they were up in his unit, Miller opened the briefcase he'd been carrying and took out a large stack of papers. Trent told him that if he expected him to read through all of that, he was out of his mind. Miller laughed, told him that this was just the consequence of bureaucracy, but that he'd go ahead and quickly summarize everything he needed to know. The government was going to pay him $6,000, which would have inflated to about $55,000 today, in benefits per year for the rest of his life. These benefits would be adjusted for inflation as long as he remained alive. The only condition was that he could never talk about what he'd seen in Vietnam. Absolutely no mention of the man to anybody. The second that he did so, they'd cut him off. All he needed to do was sign. Trent said that he'd tried squeezing some more information out of Miller, but the guy was stone-like. He wouldn't budge. He'd asked him what would happen if he didn't sign it. Maybe he wanted to tell the world exactly what he'd seen. Maybe it'd make him famous and he'd be able to make a career out of it. In response, Miller had told him they could raise that number to $7,500 a year. Trent asked him what they were so afraid of. Why didn't they want this information out there? Miller told him that wasn't his concern, but that if he were dying for some kind of answer and couldn't deal with not having one, then he'd go ahead and put it succinctly. There were certain things that the public were better off not knowing. It'd be easier for them. It would introduce less chaos and allow society to run as smoothly as possible. It wasn't that they were purposefully trying to keep civilians in the dark. They were just trying to protect them. By the end of their conversation, Trent had managed to get him up to $11,000. He still hadn't fully accepted what Miller was trying to tell him. He'd gone back and forth with him for nearly half an hour, but he was tired. He didn't want to deal with it anymore. He didn't want to think about it. The silver lining was that he wouldn't be homeless anytime soon, because there was no way he would have been able to go to work after this, at least not for a long while. He tried to focus on the positives. Now he had free time to do what he pleased. He could travel the world. He could start a business. But for the next few weeks, he did nothing at all, because he couldn't stop thinking about the man.
It was all he could focus on. He found a way around it through liquor. He drank at every meal, then he was drinking between meals, and then every hour on the hour from noon to midnight. And it was working. He was out partying so much that he wasn't thinking about it anymore. One day he was feeling generous and offered to fly my dad out to Hawaii. They'd lay on the beach, drink until they puked, etc. For the first few days, they were having a great time. It was paradise. And then one evening, they were laying on the beach. The sky was starting to turn a beautiful shade of orange. About 80 degrees, the cool wind starting to prickle the sweat on their skin. As it got darker, the beach slowly began to empty out. They had nowhere else to be, so they stayed, waited for the sunset. He'd become buzzed enough that he began to tell my dad about everything that had happened. He said that keeping it pent up inside was starting to kill him. He had to let it out. He had to tell somebody. And if there was anybody he could trust, it would have been Dad. But he didn't get far with it, stopping right before he could describe the first encounter, because that's when he noticed the figure out in the water. Everybody else had left, but this person remained, standing about knee-deep in the ocean, just standing there. The figure appeared to be tall, lanky. Trent said it looked like they were wearing pants and a jacket, though they were a bit too far for him to make out any more details beyond that. But it was freaking him out, because what the hell were they doing? He leaned forward and squinted ahead until he was able to make out what they looked like. The realization washed over him like a cold wave. He stood up and told my dad that they needed to leave. Then he ran all the way back to the hotel room and drank until he passed out. He told me it had been the same man from the jungle, wearing the same clothes. When I asked him how he could be so sure of that, he told me it was unmistakable, that it was a face he'd never forget. Afterwards, he had reached out to other members of the platoon. The few that wrote him back told him that they had also seen the man since coming back. One of them had even seen him all the way out in Italy.
And in each instance, they had been on the cusp of divulging the details of what happened in the jungle to somebody else, as if the man had somehow preempted their thoughts and showed up before they could. Then he began hearing some stranger things through the grapevine, like how the bodies of the 7 soldiers that had turned back had been found a week later. They had all been smashed together into a mound of rotting flesh that had then been gruesomely stuffed into a foxhole. He also heard that the government had done a deep dive into Bernier's background, along with correspondence that had taken place between them months earlier. They'd found weird inconsistencies, things that just didn't add up. Like the fact that the French military contacts they thought they had been talking to didn't actually exist. That every name and rank had been fabricated, but that it had been done so well they just hadn't caught it until much later. But now the French were denying Bernier's existence outright. He had never been an officer, never been part of the military. They couldn't confirm records of any schooling, or who his parents were, or if he was even born on French soil. But then he also heard reports about a man fitting Bernier's physical description who had escaped from a prison in Egypt a few years earlier. It was a notable enough event because there weren't many people in Egypt who looked like him, and escaping from a prison over there was next to impossible. He heard some other stuff as well, but at some point, it all just became too much. Trying to process it all was starting to drive him mad. No matter where he went, he couldn't stop himself from looking over his shoulder. Soon he had stopped going anywhere at all, save for the bar down the street. And he sure as hell never talked about Vietnam again. Until now. And that was it. That was his story. He hoped it had managed to shed some light on things. Mainly that isolating himself hadn't been a personal thing. He said he hoped that I understood, and that he still appreciated the efforts I made to try and talk to him. And then he told me he was sorry, that I was now in danger. I asked him how he could be so sure, Maybe after all these years, the man was gone. Maybe he'd died, or maybe he'd just moved on. Trent said he knew that wasn't the case, because he could see the man right now. He was staring at us through the window. I turned to look at the window, and for a split second I could see what appeared to be somebody's head peeking up at us near the bottom of the glass, but then I blinked and they were gone. Trent lived on the 7th floor. I called the cops despite Trent telling me not to. They searched the area but couldn't find anything. They told me that maybe it had just been a trick of the light, but to call again if I saw anything else. I didn't feel comfortable leaving Trent alone for the night, so I told him that I'd sleep in the guest room. He protested against it, told me there was no need, but I insisted, because I could see the fear in his eyes. He was terrified. Of course, I didn't get any sleep that night, but the sun came up and I never heard anything strange. When I tried to wake up Trent the next morning, I wasn't able to. There was a cool breeze in the room, and I noticed that the window was open. I sure as hell hadn't left it open, and I doubt that Trent would have opened it. I called the ambulance and they took him away. Later I learned that he was pronounced dead at the hospital. Sudden, acute liver failure. A sensible enough explanation, but the circumstances just didn't sit right with me. The funeral was only a week later. A really quick, impromptu venue. There weren't many who showed up. Other than my mom, my sister, and myself, there were some estranged relatives, a few of his drinking buddies, and then one other man that nobody else seemed to recognize. He was wearing an old windbreaker jacket and cargo pants that seemed too baggy for his frame. Although he was sitting down, I could tell that he was quite tall. His skin was pale, his features bizarre and uncanny enough that I couldn't help but stare. What freaked me out even more was that I never actually remember seeing him show up. It's like he just suddenly appeared. For a while I thought I might have been hallucinating the guy, until my sister made a remark about how much he was freaking her out. It was an open casket funeral, and the moment that they brought Trent's body out, the man was gone. I didn't see him leaving either. Ever since the funeral, strange things have been happening. It feels like I'm being followed. I'm seeing the same black SUV parked wherever I go. One time I looked through the pier hole of my apartment in the middle of the night and caught somebody in a suit standing outside my door. Not the same man from the funeral, although I've been seeing him as well, walking behind me in public, stalking me around grocery stores, sitting a few tables over in cafes and restaurants. I don't know what the fuck it wants from me. I don't know what to do about him. But now I understand what Trent had meant. That knowledge isn't always a good thing. That sometimes it can be dangerous.
The nurse whistled as she examined my shredded arm. "Your dog did this?" "He's getting on," I said grimly. "Bad hips, makes him grouchy. He doesn't mean to nip." "Uh-huh. You're gonna need stitches. So, you think it's time to, take him to the vet?" I fixed her with a glare. "Listen, lady, I took him in as a stray years ago, and in return, that animal has been a dearer friend to me than any person I've known. He deserves more than a stranger sticking him with a poison needle." Still, she was right. It was time. When I got home, Duke hid in the corner of his bed, watching me fearfully. "I am mad," I began. "You know I never could stay mad at you." Duke sniffed the air, put his head low. "I don't believe you." "Hey, I'll prove it." I showed him his leash. Instantly he jerked up. One shake of it had him padding over awkwardly, slobbering all over me. "That's right, old man," I smiled, scratching behind his ears. He rolled over in pleasure for a stomach rub. "Let's hit the woods."
I stopped by the shed to grab the shotgun. Duke didn't seem to care. He had his nose in the breeze, almost fell backward as he watched a bird overfly us. Dumb, lovable Duke. He and I used to walk for hours, play fetch until my arms ached from throwing all the sticks. But that day I could really see it, the way he winced as he moved on all fours, how he'd tire often and would simply sit and pant. In the end, we rested for a long while, just the two of us. I delayed the inevitable, of course, and it grew dark before I finally summoned the courage. "Come here, boy." Duke loafed up to me, tired but wagging his rear in contentment. "Sit," I commanded, and a sob rose in my chest as I leveled the shotgun at his head. Duke whined a little, suddenly unsure. He edged backward, sniffed at the air. Did he know somehow? I blinked back tears. "I'm sorry, old fella, but this has to be done for both of us." He opened his mouth and curled his tongue, to bite me again, I thought with a sudden chill. But he started making choking noises, and that's when I realized he was trying to talk. "Please, don't kill me," Duke rasped. I emptied both barrels of the gun right into his face. "God damn you, Duke. You always did think you were people." I decided no more pets. You wouldn't believe the difficulty in finding a stray you can work with, how hard it is to break them, to train them as a companion. Still, there's nothing sadder than an empty kennel. I just couldn't stand the sight of it. One day, I vowed never to come home to an empty house again, and grabbed Duke's leash on my way out.
I don't usually work on Sundays, but I needed some extra cash, so I took an early shift. I came home at around 2 p.m. I live in this apartment building. My apartment is on the first floor, along with another one that belongs to this dude who's rarely home. There's Mrs. Rogue's place on the ground floor, and then the second floor has two other flats, one owned by an elderly couple, and the other by this family I don't really see that often, directly above me. Sometimes I hear the kids in the morning moaning about having to get ready for school and then stomping down the stairs. Sometimes I hear hushed voices and dishes clattering. After 10 p.m., everything usually goes quiet. I got to my door, and as I was searching for my keys in my bag, I could hear voices upstairs. They were hushed and a little tense, stressing the words and mixing them together. I couldn't really make out what they were saying, but they seemed to be talking about something really important. Now, keep in mind that I've never seen these people before. I assumed they were a family because I kept hearing the kids and sounds that I generally attribute to a family home. It's not like I've personally met them. I just assumed. Anyway, as I said, I finally got a hold of my keys and unlocked the door. Yet, I didn't immediately step inside after I opened it. I don't know why I let it swing open and remained there listening for 2 more seconds, but I'm somewhat glad I did. The moment the door was heard, the voices upstairs stopped. Completely. As if they were listening to me now. I remained still. We all studied the silence for a while. I heard a singular step on the stairs above. That's when my back went cold and my muscles tensed up for whatever reason. I got the sudden urge to just go inside and shut the door behind me, which I did. Afterwards, I started putting some groceries in the fridge and doing some errands around the house. Faintly at first, then stronger, I started hearing this birthday song upstairs. I smiled and sighed. They were planning the birthday, man. That's why they were so precautious, so nervous. It sounded like there were around 5, 6 people singing, maybe. "Happy birthday, dear Jonah." That was cute. When they finished, they started again. I did find it weird, but I assumed that the kid had asked for it again. Kids love blowing out candles and whatever. It was an awfully long song. It kept looping until reaching its conclusion, just like the first time. It had a lot of unnecessary runs and filler and extra lyrics.
When they finished, a little pause followed. Then they started again in the exact same way.
Fucking weird family, I thought, and by that time I'd gotten annoyed, so I just put on my headphones and laid down on the couch. I fell asleep at around 4 or 5 p.m. I woke up from the nap, disoriented. Man, after-work naps hit the hardest. I'd slept until around 8 p.m., and the sun was peeking at me from behind some buildings, a sunset that was more blue than red, a melancholy and confusion that reminded me of how liminal your house felt when you would go to sleep after school and wake up with a sore throat and a huge pillow mark on your face, with your mood ruined, your mother suddenly calling you out to go to dinner. I swallowed, staring blankly at the window highlighted in gold and rum. I rubbed my eyes, then massaged my face. I stood up to get a glass of water, walked barefoot to the kitchen, which was now sunken in that specific 8 p.m. darkness, and stood still and silent, not knowing what I wanted from my life. Then I finally registered one important detail. The folks upstairs were still singing Happy Birthday. I listened for a while, unsure of what my reaction should be. I wondered if they had some recording playing on a loop, but that wasn't really the case, as each version sounded different from the previous. They really were weird, or maybe their kid was just eccentric. Maybe they were practicing for some performance. I started thinking. As I said, I hadn't personally met these people before, so I had no idea what they did. Maybe they really were practicing. I put my headphones on and went on trying to make some sort of dinner, even though I wasn't really hungry and my throat still hurt. I ate, watched my show, then took a shower. Their singing had started to piss me off. It was now approaching 10 p.m., and I felt the need to go upstairs and tell them to quit it. I'm not confrontational. I really don't like telling people they upset me, and most don't have an appropriate reaction at all. I didn't want to talk to them, so I called my mom. I started telling her about my day, but she interrupted me, asking about the people upstairs. Yeah, they've been doing it for hours. I don't know, it's starting to really get on my nerves. Well, go to them and knock. Aren't the other residents annoyed? The old people upstairs? I'm sure they wanted to sleep by now. Maybe I could just put on some music. That could cover them up. But do you want to listen to music? No, not really.
Then why do it to please them? Go upstairs, Michaela. I sighed and reluctantly agreed. After hanging up, I put on a sweater and unlocked my front door. The moment I opened it, the air felt a little colder. I stared at the dark hallway, illuminated by the ray of light from my door and another faint light coming from upstairs. I went up the stairs. The second floor was more animated than the first. The door to the family's apartment was slightly open, and I could see light and movement behind. I slowly approached it, then peeked inside. I could see a hallway with balloons and confetti floating around. A faint smell of candles and sweetness lingered out. I didn't want to disturb too much, so I tried to be discreet while I quietly and almost imperceptibly pushed the door slightly more. The small hallway made way to a dining room. The shadows were dancing on the walls as people clapped around the table and sang. On the table was a cake with pink and purple frosting, sprinkles, and some writing I couldn't really decipher. The song carried on, but was hoarser than I'd remembered it. People were smiling, swaying from side to side at the person sitting in front of the cake. The lighting was dim and pleasant, its only source being the candles. The people around were a little tense, but overall it reminded me of my own birthdays as a kid. Some boxes lay scattered on the floor. I tried to take a better look at them, or the kid. The child looked like a young boy with a big birthday hat on. He, I think, could have been 10 or 12, and his face was round and stretched into a big smile. I stared for a while at the teeth. I don't know what prompted me to make that observation, but he had adult teeth, which were rotten and yellow, sticking out of his mouth in abnormal directions. His eyes were wide and red as if he'd been crying for a while. I don't remember seeing him blink at all in the minutes that I watched that felt like hours. He looked really shaken and tense. I'd never seen a child like that before. Never in my life. All the courage I had before peeking through the door had evaporated. I must have zoned out watching the scene when I was pulled away from my trance. The kid shifted his eyes from the candles, which had now almost completely melted, and looked at me. I felt seen like I'd never been before. My heart completely collapsed, leaving a painful knot in my chest as I made eye contact with the child. His smile slowly faded, turning into a grimace. I wanted to run, but I was somehow frozen in place. Suddenly, he blew out the candles, and the room was engulfed in darkness. I heard something shuffle in the dark towards me, gasped, and shut the door behind me as I practically jumped down the stairs. The shuffling and scratching followed. I gripped the door and slammed it behind me just as something slammed into it from the other side. Eyes wide and unfocused, I barely managed to lock it as the banging started. The song upstairs had stopped. I looked through the peephole. The hallway was completely dark now, but I could make out the details of the face I'd looked at before in the dimly lit dining room. Only now we were at eye level, which was impossible, since that had been a kid. Had it? Or had it been just a person? The more I thought, the more I realized I had no idea what prompted me to assume that it had been a kid. The round face? Childish clothing? Trying to decipher the memory meant analyzing every detail of that horrible face, a thing I didn't want to do. The banging turned to scratching. I yelled I was going to call the police. My voice died in my throat. The banging was so strong that it was undoubtedly going to break down my door. Suddenly, I heard a distinct sound upstairs. The banging and scratching instantly stopped. It was a door opening. The elderly couple's door. "Hey, what on earth are you doing? It's the middle of the night!" I watched through the peephole as the kid, not a kid, walked away from my door, upstairs. "Quit it before I call the police. It's enough that I have to hear your kid's tantrums every day, lady, but—" The voice abruptly stopped. I listened, barely breathing. No scream, no sound, nothing. Faint scratching, then shuffling. Then a faint cry that sounded like forced sobs. I silently dialed up the police and barely managed to whisper what was going on, afraid that I might be heard. As I was detailing the problem, I looked through the peephole once again to be greeted by that face, grimaced, eyes bloodshot and sunken into the head. "You're welcome to join next year. That's why we left the door open," came the voice of an adult out of the face of a 12-year-old. I gasped and ducked, as if that would save me. The police came in around half an hour, which was an insanely long amount of time. They went upstairs and sealed off the entirety of the second floor. They refused to give me details. I had to wait for the headlines and accept some vague answers from the numerous phone calls I had given since. "Miss, there were never kids living upstairs. 2 of them were grown-ups, but 2 of them were pretending to be kids." They refused to tell me what had happened to the elderly couple. They barely mumbled something that included kidnapping, massacre, disembowelment. Some of the victims, which had been many, were hostages, made to play along. The presents were just pieces of flesh, toys made of bones with bows on them. One of them was a teeth necklace. I'm going through a really hard time now, trying to move all my stuff without having to go to that place too often. I can't sell it or rent it out, maybe to some true crime fanatic. I moved in with my parents, but I asked them to add extra locks to their doors and windows and security cameras everywhere. They assumed I was paranoid and suffering from PTSD. I let them believe that. However, I watched the security footage of that night showing the outside of my door. The birthday boy I'd spoken through hadn't gone back upstairs. He just crawled to the window and jumped out. I don't know where he is now. I hope it goes both ways.
I don't remember when it started. I was too young. Johnny, one of my neighbors, used to sneak in through the crawl space at the back of my closet to play. Even now, I can still picture him so clearly in my head, his sharp blue eyes embedded in sunken sockets, his filthy, unwashed hands, fingernails overgrown and caked in dirt, his crooked smile with 3 front teeth missing. I can smell him, too. The musk of sweat and grime, the sickly sweet stench of someone who's been rolling in grass and dead leaves. He seems like such a recent memory, even now, 19 years later. As much as I want to, I can't forget him. Not after what happened in the summer of '06. Knock, knock, knock. 3 knocks from inside my closet. That was the sign that Johnny was there. I opened the door, greeted by my friend, his toothy smile on full display. I returned the gesture, inviting him into my room. "Hurry up, I want to show you the new game I got." Pokémon Emerald had come out a year prior, and I had just managed to scrounge up enough money to buy it. I took Johnny by the wrist, his lanky frame bending awkwardly to accommodate. He didn't protest. He listened intently as I explained the game mechanics, his eyes glued to the screen. That's one of the things I liked about Johnny. He was an adult, but he didn't treat me like all the other grown-ups did. He listened to what I had to say. He made me feel seen. Maybe that's why I didn't tell anyone sooner. After around 30 minutes, Johnny told me that he had something of his own that he wanted me to see. I perked up, temporarily distracted from my game. "I found it at the park today," he said, extending a cheap camera for me to hold. I didn't want to put him down. I had a way nicer one than that, but he was obviously proud of it. "Neat," I said, turning it over in my hands. "Want to take a picture?" Johnny nodded, a grin inching across his lips. I leaned in, and he took a snapshot of us. We couldn't see what it looked like. He'd need to get the film developed for that. "Cool. I'll give you one when I get them back." We suddenly heard footsteps creaking down the hall. Johnny's eyes grew wide. We knew what that meant. He scrambled to my closet, shutting himself inside before my mother reached my room to tell me that dinner was ready.
I didn't see Johnny very much after that. That wasn't too unusual, though. Sometimes he would go a week or so without coming to see me. I think about 10 days had passed before I heard the signal from my closet again. Knock, knock, knock. I eagerly leapt up and threw open the door. Johnny's familiar grin was there to greet me. He accompanied me to the rug where we usually sat, stationed in front of the tube TV. "Come on, Johnny. You said you'd play Jenga with me last time. I got the blocks set up already," I said, tugging him to where the tower sat undisturbed from when I'd built it days prior. Yeah, I remember. But first, I got something for you," he said, pulling a photograph from his pocket. I'd forgotten all about it. "Here, this is for you." He handed it to me, and I glanced down at our smiling faces. My eyes traveled from the photo to the corkboard on my wall. Johnny understood the implication. "Joey, you gotta keep this picture somewhere safe, okay? Somewhere your mom can't find it. We'll both get in big trouble if she sees." I nodded. We'd been over this plenty of times before. Mom couldn't know about Johnny, not ever. If she found out, he wouldn't be able to come over anymore. "Atta boy," he said, ruffling my hair. "Now, let's get to this Jenga game." Johnny started coming by more frequently after that. He began showing up almost nightly, to the point where it was becoming routine. He would knock, I'd let him in, and we'd play with action figures or board games or draw pictures until Mom would come down the hall and scare him off. I didn't have many friends in school, so I really enjoyed our arrangement. That is, until one night when Johnny came back different. A day went by without him popping in, then 2, then 3. After I hadn't heard from him in 2 weeks, I was starting to worry. What if something bad happened? As much as his absence shook me, I knew there wasn't a thing I could do about it. I was just a kid. But to my relief, eventually he did come back. Now I wish he never did. I was sitting on my bed reading a comic book when I heard it. 3 knocks from inside my closet. These didn't sound like Johnny's regular knocks, though. They were quicker, more frantic.
I didn't register the difference at first. I was just happy that Johnny had finally returned. I leapt off my bed and threw open the door with a huge grin on my face. I expected to find Johnny standing there, bearing that same toothy smile that he always did. But when I opened that door, I was met with a different sight. Johnny stood before me, but he wasn't smiling. He looked even dirtier than he normally did. The coat he wore pockmarked with holes, and his hands caked in a layer of grime. He had scabs on his face as if he'd been relentlessly picking at the flesh. His eyes darted around the room, shifting from one object to another.
My heart dropped. I could tell that something was wrong. "Johnny, are you okay?" I asked, a sudden feeling of unease coursing through me. Johnny's eyes snapped to me, his scleras marred by spider-webbing red veins. He grabbed my wrist and tried ushering me toward the closet. "Joey, there's something I have to show you. Come with me." He pulled me hard, his dirty fingernails digging into my flesh. Little red droplets appeared, tumbling onto the floor. By that point, I was scared. This man was not the gentle, caring friend I knew. I screamed, both out of fear and pain. I could hear Mom's footsteps crashing down the hall in response. Normally, Johnny would have hidden at the sound, but not this time. He was determined to take me with him. "Joey, you have to see this. I need you to see this. They're going to get me soon." Tears involuntarily welled in my eyes. I didn't know what Johnny had to show me, and I didn't want to know. Fortunately, I would never have to see what it was. Mom had long since forgotten about the panel at the back of my closet, buried by old clothes and shoes. Inside was a small storage room. It turns out that there was never a crawl space that led outside. I'd been lied to. But even more disturbing was what the police found in their search. Among a slew of wrappers and empty food containers, they discovered a sleeping bag, dozens of dirty needles, and photographs. Hundreds of them. I was in every single one. Walking home from school, eating breakfast, playing with the neighborhood kids. I didn't know how he got some of them. That still terrifies me. How many times had Johnny been lurking just out of sight? Additionally, they found a notebook. It only had one entry. The photograph that I'd taken with Johnny was taped inside with the words, "Johnny and Joey, best friends forever," written beneath. I don't know how many years he received. We moved shortly after he was apprehended, and Mom didn't ever bring it up again. I don't blame her. I tried my best to forget. But even after all this time, I can't get it out of my head. Sometimes I glance down at the tiny scar on my wrist, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd followed Johnny into that room.
"Jake, toss me the knife and go get the shotgun," I say to my son. Mr. Harlington, our neighbor, has his fingers wrapped tightly around my wrist as we stand in the living room. He's now a shell, but he isn't empty. He just isn't here right now. Mr. Harlington's eyes burn a cobalt blue as he reaches into my mind and begins his work. 2 months ago, a cerebral contagion began to spread. It started with a handful, then it exploded into an army of infected, all spreading a single consciousness, overriding the minds of everyone they touch. There are millions of them now. I struggle to stall this takeover as I'm pulled into a memory of my wife, Hope. Hope reaches into a half-collapsed six-pack as she pulls out the last beer. We sit at the edge of Kincaid Lake. Her black hair is intoxicating. I run my fingers through it. A thought surges within me as I fight for control of this memory. No. 4 for me, 2 for you, she snorts. So sorry, Tony. Next pack is on me. She pops the lid, swigs it down, and raises a fist above her head, triumphant. Not yet. Outside the memory, I hear Jake gasping in the back room as he wrestles the shotgun from under my bed. He's terrified. The memory begins to fade. Again. Hope reaches into the half-collapsed six-pack and pulls out the last beer. Jake is still struggling. A clatter of shells strikes the floor as he races to load the gun. 4 for me, 2 for you, she says, not laughing now. Thank you, Tony, for keeping your promise. This isn't her, because I shot her in the kitchen 2 weeks ago when I saw her eyes had changed. I promised her I'd do anything to keep our son safe. Jake's feet pound against the wooden floor. Sobs pour from him as he enters the living room. Hope has finished the last beer from the case 6 times. The memory is collapsing as I stretch it one more time. She is crying now as she pulls yet another beer from the case. We both are. We are so far off script now. Thank you for being the best wife and mother we could have had. My fingers tighten around her hair. Her hot breath strikes my ear as my last memory fades. The hammers click on the shotgun. I love you, Dad. Everything goes dark.